If you drive out of town here and through the countryside, you occasionally see some billboards that people have put up with Bible verses on them. I'm sure many of you have seen those. I kind of like driving past them. I kind of wonder who put them up. How did they decide which verse they were going to use? We drive out north basically 3 times a summer, and this one always catches my eye. Christ died for the ungodly. I'm sure some of you have seen it. I won't tell you how long it took me clicking through Google Street View, trying to find it, one arrow at a time, but it's about 15 kilometers outside of Waterloo. I wonder what people think when they go past this one. What do they think of when they see the word ungodly? Maybe they think about the driver that just passed them on the solid yellow going way faster than they're going. Maybe they think about an addict they saw downtown causing trouble. I wonder if the most people driving past it, if they would think that they're ungodly. If you ask this question in Judea in the first century, who's ungodly? I think you would quickly get told the list. It would be pagans, sinners, and maybe worst of all, tax collectors. This morning we're starting a new sermon series, and it's called Jesus Calling People to Change. And today we're going to talk about tax collectors. In the time that Jesus was preaching in Judea and Galilee and Samaria, the Roman Empire ruled just about everything around the Mediterranean Sea. All the areas that Jesus traveled were basically firmly under Roman control. They were essentially occupied territories. The Jewish people didn't want to be ruled by pagans. So anger against Rome is always there. It's always kind of simmering below the surface. Actually, a few decades after Jesus' life, the Jewish people revolt against Rome. But by 70 AD, Rome has come in with an army and flattened Jerusalem and destroyed the temple there. As part of the occupation, Rome collected all sorts of taxes. So there was some that were like a yearly tax per person, and there was others that were more like tolls for using a road or for moving goods past a certain point. You might pay it to someone in a booth. And to simplify things, Rome put local people in charge of collecting the taxes. They knew the language, they knew what was going on. And people hated these tax collectors, just hated them. It was bad enough that the tax collectors were pretty much unfairly taking money from them, but these were Jews who had betrayed their fellow Jews to work for the pagan Romans for money. They were way, way worse than sinners. Basically, there's the people that you thought were scum, and then lower than that, that's where the tax collectors were. It seems like most Jews might even say that if you were a tax collector, you weren't even really Jewish anymore. You were no longer part of Abraham's family because you'd betrayed it. We're about to look at a passage in Matthew about a tax collector, and when the Archbishop John Chrysostom in the 4th century preached on this passage, he said that the reason Matthew included it is because there was no way of life meaner or worse than being a tax collector. If you have a Bible and want to follow along, please turn to Matthew 9. We're going to start in verse 9. Matthew 9:9. This is a story from Matthew's Gospel about Matthew himself being called. Based on the very early church historian Eusebius, it's usually assumed that the Matthew from this story is the author of the Gospel of Matthew and one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. And he was a tax collector. The same story is in Luke and Mark with a few little differences. So it says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and he followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. This is a pretty embarrassing story for Matthew. He's one of Jesus' disciples. And it turns out he was basically actively doing tax collecting when he meets Jesus. Imagine the Apostle Matthew teaching new Christians later on, and he gets to this part of the story, and he has to explain how he met Jesus. But Matthew doesn't hide it. Actually, there are 3 lists of the apostles in the New Testament. There's one later in the Gospel of Matthew here, and then there's another one in Luke and Mark. And in Luke and Mark, it lists them, and Matthew's list is one of the apostles. It just says Matthew. But when Matthew lists the 12 apostles, when it comes to his own name, it says Matthew the tax collector. He owns up to what he was. But he says Jesus called him, and he stood up, and he followed. If Matthew was here and he drove down Northfield and he saw that billboard, Christ died for the ungodly, he would know exactly who it was talking about. It was talking about him. It was him. But the Pharisees, they got offended by what Jesus did. It says that they said, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors?" If these Pharisees were to see that same billboard, they would know exactly who it was talking about too. It's Matthew and all his friends. And for some reason, Jesus is eating with all of them. But Jesus says, those who are well don't need a doctor, but those who are sick. And then to top it off, he says, I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners. When Matthew was called by Jesus, Matthew realized he needed to change. He left his tax booth behind forever and followed Jesus. He knew he needed a doctor. But what about the Pharisees? Are they sick too? They follow all the rules, maybe even some extra ones. They're not betraying their fellow Jews like Matthew. And of course they don't want to follow Jesus. He's hanging out with people that they know are ungodly. Jesus told another parable, and it's not recorded in Matthew, but it's in Luke's gospel. But I wonder if when Jesus told this, he had Matthew in mind. I wonder how it would have felt to be Matthew and be there hearing Jesus teach it. This one's found in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, if you want to follow along. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. We know both of these men needed forgiveness, but only one knew that they needed it. Part of answering Jesus' call to follow is having the humility to know that we don't deserve it any more than anybody else. We are unworthy. Matthew knew this, so when he got up and he followed Jesus, he left his old life behind. Now, when billions of people anywhere on the planet, in any language, pick up a New Testament, the first words that they read when they open it is the good news according to Matthew. And when you read through that good news, you find that Jesus himself taught over and over about humility. When Jesus taught people to pray, he told people to go do it in secret. Jesus taught people to give to the needy in secret, to not even let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. I don't think anybody could be that good. like half of your body doesn't even realize what's happening. But that's how much you have to avoid pride. When we do things for other people to see, we're pretending that we're worthy. But we're not. And near the end of Matthew's gospel, we see the consequence of all of our pride, all of our unfaithfulness, all of our sin as Jesus dies on the cross. Sin is insidious. Sometimes for us, sin might be out in the open, like what Matthew was doing out in his tax booth, betraying his people by serving the pagan Romans. But it can also happen hidden deep in our hearts, in our high opinion of ourselves, and maybe our low opinion of others. I recently heard the scholar N.T. Wright talk about sin like this. Sometimes you can't see how serious a problem is until you see how awful the solution to that problem is. And the solution for our sin is Christ crucified. Christ died for the ungodly. The verse that they chose for this billboard is from the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. It's Romans 5:6. Here's the slightly longer version. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So the next time you're driving out of town, and maybe you pass this billboard, remember that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Let's be like Matthew, the tax collector. And with humility, let's get up and follow Jesus.